Hello and welcome to Out of India Theory. Hope you guys are doing well. In today's video, we're going to be talking to Dr. Kimberly Engels. Dr. Kimberly is the Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Molloy University in Long Island, New York. Her research interests include existentialism, bioethics, Native American philosophy, and philosophy of the paranormal and anomalous, UAPs, and philosophy of pop culture. She is the Director of Research at the John Mack Institute. She's an advisory board member for the Society for UAP Studies and a student of the Sanctuary Center for Shamanic Studies. And out of some of the courses that she offers include Phenomenology of UFOs/UAP and Shamanic Worldviews and UFOs, UAP, Ancient Wisdom, New Paradigms. Dr. Kim, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm curious, when I went through your fields of interest, as a professor of philosophy, I understand, topics like Native American philosophy and philosophy of pop culture and existentialism and so on. But how does the paranormal and the anomalous and UAP topic, fit into this? Like, how are you interested in that?
I mean, it's a good question, and I haven't always been interested in this. This is a more recent interest that's emerged for me in the past, about 5 years now. Um, but existentialism and phenomenology are about lived experience, right? It's about philosophy of how we experience the world as individual subjects. And when I first when the UAP phenomenon or the UFO phenomenon first came to my attention, I was very interested, not so much in the technological objects, which I mean I find that fascinating too, but I'm more interested in the lived experience of the witnesses. So what individuals are reporting that they experienced during the encounter and in the aftermath of the encounter, and how that leads to changes in their epistemic framings, in their ontological understanding of the world, in their metaphysical beliefs, in their ethical commitments. All of that is part of the UFO UAP experience. And it really was a very natural fit with all of the other work that I've done so far because, I was interested in phenomenology. I was also interested in ethics. And I've done some work in Native American philosophy, and if you look at Artie Six Killer Clark's work, there's a long history of experiences with UFOs or star beings from various indigenous American traditions. So it really, to me, all weaves together quite naturally. Although I understand sometimes when folks look at it, they're like, "Oh, whoa, that came out of nowhere." But for me, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was the experience of UFOs and the encounters that people have with them and the potential occupants are profound transformative experiences that really change how the individual kind of orients themselves in the world, kind of the attitude they take towards being. And that's what I find very interesting, and that's what my work and interest is rooted in.
With the mainstreaming of the topic of UFOs in the recent last few years, this is like somehow in the academia, it's more like acceptable to talk about UFOs and all that, right? So, do you find that it is more accepted now as a legitimate piece of research topic than it was probably a decade ago for an academic to touch, even to say UAPs and UFOs?
Yes, there's definitely been progress. It's more acceptable. It's not. I wouldn't say that it's without its risks or without its stigma. There are, there's several people who have been very blunt that they don't take me seriously anymore because I started researching UFOs, and that's fine for them. But it does reflect that there are still, there's still stigma in the culture, but there's also, it's actually a bit deeper than stigma. There's kind of a UFOs present kind of an ontological threat to our understanding of what the world is. And so there are some strong reactions from people in various sectors, including academia,
Right.
against taking this topic seriously. But I do think If you look 10 years ago or 30 years ago when John Mack was trying to, do his studies and he was getting, basically his tenure was coming under review for what he was trying to do. We've definitely made progress since then, and it has become more acceptable to speak about certain aspects of the topic, especially talking about the technological capabilities or the scientific aspects of the instrumentation. That has become much more acceptable in academic spaces.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned John Mack. I was going to bring him in at some point because I find his work very interesting, and I think a lot of people agree that he was one of those mainstream people who took it very seriously, with approached with a lot of earnestness, and took all these accounts of people who were, abducted and met with aliens and so on. So I'm going to bring that in at some point. But just to step back a little bit, we mentioned a few words which I think maybe if we can spend just a few minutes trying to sort of explain in layman's terms for our audience. One is phenomenology. I must admit, it is a word that it took me a while to get right because I was sure I was saying it wrong. Phenomenology.
Yep, you
So,
got it.
what is it all about?
Phenomenology, it's a field of academic philosophy, and it's also a methodology that was founded by Edmund Husserl. And Husserl wanted to center the lived experience and to study the structure of conscious experience by asking, how are objects encountered and experienced in the world through the first person perspective, right? And so articulating very clearly so phenomenological analysis in a UFO event, articulating very clearly what did the individual see? What did the individual hear? What did they sense in their body? Um, what emotions did they feel during the experience? What was the affect um, that they experienced? How did they form judgments about this? Did they see it and think, huh, that's an airplane, and then it did something that made them realize it couldn't be an airplane, and they just say, oh, whoa, that's not an airplane. If so, how did they form that judgment? What were the effects in the aftermath? Okay, so studying and kind of articulating very clearly what was experienced, what was lived, in what conscious modalities. And the second part that's very important is that you suspend judgment on the source or origin of those experiences, of that firsthand experience. So he advocated for this sense of bracketing. Okay, so you describe what the individual saw. Maybe they saw they saw a humanoid figure and it had big black eyes and it was wearing a spacesuit. And as they experienced it and lived it, they heard an audible voice inside their head that they interpreted as communication. But you don't jump to a conclusion. You suspend your assumptions about how the world is. So you don't jump to the conclusion that, oh, that was obviously an alien spacecraft and they were communicating with an alien being. You don't jump to the conclusion, oh, well, that was clearly an angel or a demon or something like that. And you also don't jump to the conclusion that, oh, well, they must be obviously hallucinating because according to the scientific worldview, they couldn't have possibly experienced that. You look at the experience as it was lived and you understand what was given in experience, how they lived it, how they interpreted it, how they made sense of it, and you kind of that's your starting point of analysis, and that helps us have a much more honest representation of what the lived experience of UFOs or UAP is like. That is not being filtered, through a particular framework or a particular hypothesis about what UFOs are.
So, in a sense, I guess this would be about what they call qualia, like when you say lived-in experience. Is that the same thing as qualia?
So qualia, yeah, it would be qualia is the the subjective nature of firsthand experience. So describing the qualia would be part of the phenomenological analysis.
Okay.
Um, Yeah, so part of the phenomenological method is describing the qualia, the sensations that they felt from that first person point of view. But it's also about trying to identify the actual, what we call the eidos, or the essence, the structure of different types of lived experiences. And that includes qualia, but it's not reducible to them.
You said methodology. So normally when in this nuts and bolts research, where people think of UFOs as craft and so on, when they capture signals on their thermal cameras and so on, so there is a methodology there. When I think of methodology, there are specific ways of analyzing, the specific results that you can achieve in a lab. I think they expect some sort of reproducibility and repeatability. But when it comes to a human experience, a human's lived in experience, there is so much of variety in the experience, number one, like you mentioned. And two, and this is probably a good segue into your article, which prompted me to get in touch with you and have this chat, which is this beautiful essay that I read in the blog section of Society for UAP Studies, Humans as Sensors, Phenomenology and the Life World as Grounds of All Knowledge. So is the lived in human experience reliable enough to study a phenomenon as elusive and anomalous as UAPs? Because there's so much variety in the experience itself, and also depending on people's cultural background, educational background, and how they report it, and language, and maybe how they recall it. So is there a standardization protocol here or something like this?
So one of the questions is, what's the bar for reliable enough? Is it reliable enough to meet the standards of the scientific method? No, but it doesn't have to be, because the scientific method was never made to study human experience. It was made to study the world of causal interactions, the natural world, the physical world, and to understand how different objects in the physical world are different interactions within the physical world. So witness experience is not like that. And many aspects of witness experience are not going to be observable and repeatable under controlled conditions. But then there becomes this false dichotomy. There becomes this idea that because witness testimony does not meet the standards of scientific evidence, and I'll admit that it does not, but because it doesn't meet the standards of scientific evidence, that it just is meaningless, and then it's nothing, and then it just gets thrown out. And that's not also the case. So we can learn things from witness testimony, and we can introduce different standards, different evidentiary standards for piecing together witness testimony. This idea Michael Bolander has suggested the standard of reasonable doubt. Others have used that standard before. The idea that, given these circumstances, what is the most likely explanation? It doesn't mean that we've proved it definitively through the scientific method, but what is most likely given this conglomerance of, of data? Now, the part of your point, you were saying people come from different cultural backgrounds. People have different levels of education in terms of identification. That's where phenomenology becomes so helpful, because if they see something and they say, oh, that was an alien, okay, we can note that they interpreted it as an alien, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily accept their interpretation. We
Right.
note what it was, right? Well, what did they just see? They saw a humanoid, and they felt in their body, while this humanoid was there, they had a very strong sensation in their chest, or maybe the opposite, they had a feeling of apathy. They saw this being and they were strangely apathetic. That's something that comes up in the literature a lot too, or in this descriptions. And so we unpack exactly what they experienced, and then the more accounts that we look through, we can start looking for patterns, or we can start uncovering the ways that it resists patterns. Because so much, read Bertrand Mulhoy's piece in Limina. There's so much about this that is elusive. There's so much that, there's accounts that you'll read, and three witnesses see one thing, and two witnesses see something totally different. And so, and maybe those three agree with each other and those two agree with each other. And then, so what do you do with that? that becomes very, it becomes very interesting, because on the one side you can just say, well, three people saw this and two people saw that, so let's throw it away. But maybe there's something more significant that we can say with that. Maybe that the fact that there's agreement, intersubjective agreement, and points of intersubjective, disagreement. Maybe that is telling us something about the way that this phenomenon presents in experience, and maybe that's telling us something about what it is. So when we're
Right.
talking about reliable enough, the question is reliable enough for what? What do we want to do with this testimony? And just because it doesn't necessarily prove everything through the standards of the scientific method doesn't mean that there's nothing we can learn from it at all.
Right. And I guess in a way, it also gives you a lot of insight into the nature of the human psyche and consciousness itself, as much as it might do of the phenomenon, right? Based on how we process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you can't necessarily separate those two things. And that isn't saying that, oh, this is just all in everybody's mind, but there's a co-creation going on. There's the phenomenon, and then there's the perception of it. And it becomes extremely difficult, even in just looking at modern quantum physics, to disentangle the observer from the observed. Like we're
Right.
in relationship all of the time. So understanding how this shows up to us in our perception and our psyche, I think, is part of understanding what it is.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the quantum mechanics analogy, because one thing that I've always felt is, if an observation can change something that is being observed, and that's the one big missing factor that I see in the equations. I mean, in the equations, the observer himself, the consciousness, which is like the background over which everything happens itself, is missing from the equations. So I guess this would be phenomenology would be equivalent of introducing that into the study. I do know for a fact that our understanding or interpretation of something, just because of the way the human mind and the memory works, can change. It's very mutable over time. So, do you think, what is the best time to get a witness account? In the sense, is it immediately after something, especially if it was traumatic, or after time has passed when they've had time to process? And is it in their normal state of mind, or would you hypnotize them?
So first of all, in terms of time, there's value in both. There's value in getting the account immediately after what happened, because that's when it's going to be freshest in their mind. And so, if possible, the sooner that you can get the account when it's most fresh is going to be most helpful, in terms of there being minimal distortion in terms of how they remember it. At the same time, if they are true traumatized and in too much ontological shock to speak about it, you may need to wait until they've processed it enough to be able to speak. The issue of hypnosis is a big can of worms, but I'll give my sense on it, my 2 cents. Um, First of all, if they have waking recall, it is better to to just get the account through waking recall, because when someone is hypnotized, there is an increased ability, or an increased possibility for distortion. You know, for someone to be susceptible to be like being led, like
Yeah.
directed towards an experience or something like that. So there needs to be very great care that's taken place if some type of alternate state of consciousness or hypnosis is being used. But hypnosis can be useful because very often in these experiences, there's a gap of time that the person doesn't have any recall of.
Yeah.
Okay, that's why John Mack. Well, you said you'd get to him later, but he used hypnosis, and that's something that was both a benefit and a criticism for what he did. But often there's things that they remember, and they usually remember seeing the UFO, and maybe they remember, like, the last thing they remember is seeing a humanoid figure at the end of their bed or something like that. And then there's this gap, of time, and then they come to, and there's just that portion of the experience is missing. And so hypnosis can become, when done with a trained practitioner, somebody like Mac, who had psychiatric and therapeutic and clinical training. Hypnosis could be a meaningful tool to help someone get into a relaxed state of mind where they feel safe to kind of unlock and visit that memory. And
Right.
explore what may have occurred. Now, for phenomenological analysis, from a research perspective, we have to differentiate. Okay, was this a memory that they recalled spontaneously, or was this a memory that they only recalled under hypnosis? And we just indicate, we mark. Okay, this was recalled via hypnosis. Um, so there may have been more of a, maybe more distortion of the experience. Again, it doesn't mean that it doesn't tell us anything meaningful. It just means that they needed, to get into a more relaxed state of consciousness before it could be unpacked. So, the best methods really depend. There's so much that depends on the case. There's so much that depends on what the individual remembers and what they don't.
Right.
That depends on how they are dealing with the aftermath. But another thing based on time, because usually the experience right afterwards can be quite traumatic, quite shocking. But what John Mack found and what others have found is that over time, like years later, that's when individuals honestly start experiencing the most profound forms of transformation in reaction to these experiences, like their meaning making, their sense making, their integration of what occurred. And so it can also be very useful to get, interview people later on to get that kind of information and have a more, robust understanding of how the phenomenon has, or how their encounter has affected their life over time.
What I usually read in popular abduction accounts is how I don't know if you look at the Men in Black scenario or whatever. It's almost like either their memory of the incident is purposefully wiped by or suppressed by these beings, whatever they are, or there is a fake memory implanted. So there is a understanding that what they tell you at face value may not really be what they actually felt, and they may have to necessarily be hypnotized to know exactly what happened to them, sort of release it from their subconscious or something like that.
So phenomenologically, we want to be careful with this. What we can say is that people often have a gap of memory. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the beings erased their memory. It just means that they have a gap. And there's multiple things that could explain that gap. Sometimes when something is really traumatic, the brain, as a defense memory, will block it out, right? Or maybe in the process of what they're doing, there is some kind of an alteration where they're, the beings, the alleged beings, do something to alter the memory. And then the other thing you're talking about is a screen memory, where you said that there's like a fake memory, and those are common. Again, we don't know necessarily that it's the beings who are inserting a fake memory. It could be the complexities of the human mind, that is the brain coming into contact with something they've never seen before, and so they instead see it as an owl or a deer, or a beautiful woman as a screen memory that sometimes is seen. And then later they realized that memory was kind of there as a protective device for something that was much more ontologically shocking, and that they probably didn't have any framework to process at the time. Or it could be some combination of both. I just wanted to be cautious because the verdict, the jury's still out. We don't really know why people remember it differently, or why there's often some kind of a screen memory there. It could be something that's coming from the UFO intelligence, or it could be something that's coming from our minds and how we are interpreting a very strange experience that the brain doesn't really know what to make sense of. But absolutely, screen memories are part of this phenomenon. It's part of the way that it presents in lived experience, and
Right.
gaps of missing time where there's a blockage in the memory are also a part of how it's experienced.
What about subconsciously? I promise I'll get to John Mack next.
No
What
worries.
about what about subconsciously? And this is also a legitimate criticism that I've read. Is there's so much of alien, and abduction and in popular culture and movies, and it's been going on for so many decades that by now, when someone says, when you tell a kid alien, he'll probably draw a gray figure with, like a little big eyes and everything. So it's almost like it's the idea of these beings has seeped into the collective memory, as collective, I don't know what you call it, consciousness or subconsciousness of people. So there is also that where who knows, they've been somehow unconsciously inspired by some old episode of Star Trek that they watched or something like this. So how can we be sure that what they're recalling is their own, you know?
First of all, you can't be 100% sure because everything that you're recalling is going to be influenced by all kinds of things. Your cultural worldview, your religious worldview, the media, the things that you've seen on TV, the way that you've seen things represented. However, it is not the case, when they released, what was it? Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and the alien was presented in a very particular way with that. It did not change how abductees were reporting the experience. And if you look at cases, and if you look at cases prior to the little image of the gray alien going mainstream, there were elements in them that remained consistent, that are not widely known to the public, that are not part of X-Files. And I even hesitate to say some of them because then the more that they get put out into pop culture, the more that it becomes, then this objection comes back. Oh, it's just something that they heard. But I'll just give one. That state of apathy. It's common enough that people call it alien apathy. And it's this reported sense of the witnesses that when they're confronted with something extremely bizarre, whether it's just they just had 5 hours of missing time, or they just woke up in a place that they weren't supposed to be, or I know someone who woke up and he saw something at the end of his bed and it turned around and walked through the wall, and that you should be feeling, your nervous system should be going up to 11. You should be in fight or flight mode, and instead they're just very apathetic, and they turn around and they get back in bed and go to sleep. People report that over and over, right? Or little things about their partner being switched off. I was sitting there trying to wake up my partner and they were just dead to the world, completely asleep. They also have presented, prior to the gray alien going mainstream, there were varieties in the ways that these beings were being interpreted, but people were consistently reporting that the ones who are involved in abduction experiences in particular, are the grays with the big black eyes. Occasionally, also, the mantis beings might be there in an abduction experience. But those remained consistent throughout, variations in how this was presented in pop culture. And so the idea that it's completely uninfluenced and that we would know it was 100% their own, no, it's not. Obviously, there's going to be aspects of worldview, of culture, of just that individual person that are going to shape how they interpreted what they witnessed.
Right.
But again, that doesn't mean that it's reducible to just being cultural representations. Like the Ariel school encounter, the students, some of them drew that being and recounted that being as having like long black hair, and some of them recounted him as being completely bald. And there was more than one student who actually said that he had hair. The majority said no, he was bald with the big black eyes, and there's a few that said I saw him with hair. And that actually is that at face value, someone might say, oh, that's goes against their credibility, but it actually goes for it, because it makes sense that if 60 people saw something and it was ontologically shocking, it was like this being that they'd never seen before, it makes sense that there would be certain things that they remember and would remember the same, and certain things that they would remember different. That's just literally the way that intersubjective testimony works. There's points of agreement, and then there's deviations as well. And I'll just leave a final point on this because it's important. But in Thomas Bulliard's book, The Myth and Mystery of UFOs, he talks about standards for witness testimony, and he says generally standards are going, or accounts are going to be stronger if they show some similarity with other cases, and if they deviate from our cultural expectations in some way, right? If everything about the account is just what we would culturally expect based on the alien trope, then we probably, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was false, but we would rank that as having a bit lower credibility. The most credible cases are going to show some similarities, but there's also going to be some things about it that deviate from cultural expectation. And that's how you kind of find the cases that have the highest levels of credibility.
I just want to quickly bring in John Mack finally. John Mack, to those who don't know, was a very celebrated Harvard psychiatrist who was also a Pulitzer-winning author of a book. But he also extensively studied abduction phenomena, I believe. And he interviewed a lot of people who believed they had been abducted by aliens. And he thought, I mean, in his opinion, they really believed what they were saying. It wasn't like they weren't like faking it. And how did you draw upon his research or his methodology? Like, how has John Mack been an influence on your way of looking at this?
Oh, I mean, John Mack has been pivotal to my understanding of this because, so first of all, as you said, he was a very credible Harvard psychiatrist. He was a Pulitzer Prize winner. He had just credible in every sense of the word, and just established, respected within the psychiatric community. And when he looked at this, he admitted that when he first started looking at this, he thought that he was going to find some kind of psychopathology. He thought that he was going to be the one to first diagnose these people as mentally ill. And that's not what he found. But he also came up against something very important, which was that fully understanding what's going on with these experiences requires an expansion of our ontologies and of our worldviews. Like this idea of physical reality being all that there is fundamentally challenged by these experiences in a really significant way. And they also challenge our understanding of what knowledge is, of what consensus is, of what subjectivity and intersubjectivity are. And so he, in his second book, Passport to the Cosmos, he started making connections with indigenous people from various parts of the world. He had one from North America, one from South America, one from Africa, because there are cultural frameworks where there is a much wider understanding of what reality is, and a much wider understanding of what knowledge is, and how we come to have knowledge of ourselves and knowledge of the world. And so, he was very influential that to fully understand this, we need an epistemic expansion, we need a metaphysical expansion, we need an ontological expansion. We need to expand our understandings of what credibility is, our understandings of what, our understandings of what is sufficient, or to say
Right.
that something is true could mean. All of those problems that he came up against stemmed from, a lack of a conceptual framework to fully understand what's going on with these experiences. My work has just kind of picked up where his has left off. He understood these as forms of transformative experience, that we need an expanded ontology and an expanded epistemology to understand. And so that's kind of where I've picked up, and his work has been integral to the work that I am trying to do.
I just want to quickly bring in this article that I read, which you wrote on Society for UAP Studies blog, which started this all, which is humans as sensors. So you were arguing that in the more scientific methodology, understandably with instrumentation and everything, there's a reliance. Okay, that's understandable, on instrument data and less on human beings as credible witnesses. And you were arguing that there is a case to be made to take humans as sensors more seriously. So could you just like quickly expand on or elaborate what you meant and why you believe so?
In the 20th century, there was a move towards this ideal of objectivity, this idea of trying to remove the first person and kind of establish a view from nowhere. And the way that was seen as most conducive to doing that was to remove the human altogether as much as possible, and start relying on, various forms of machines, and then instruments, and to kind of mathematize the world, and to say that the real world is the world as it is measured by these devices. Husserl also had a problem with that, or he just had a criticism of that. And I am sympathetic to his criticism as well, right? And it's not that these instruments aren't giving us reliable data about the world, but they're giving us data about one aspect of the world, right? They're giving us data about, um, you know, the different mathematical measurements within the physical world. But there's also the world as we live it, what Husserl called the life world, the world of
Right.
experience. And Husserl's point was the world of experience, the world as we live it, is just as real as that world that's on the instruments. What's on the instruments is just a different way of talking about the world. It's a different way of making our understanding of one aspect of the life world more precise, but it doesn't replace lived experience. And so as we kind of progressed, especially in modern Western democracies where the scientific method became more and more the grounds of all knowledge, the other disciplines were expected to follow for their findings to be, in alignment with science, there became less and less trust of human experience. But Husserl's point was, even an instrument, it needs a human to interpret the data. It needs a human to make sense of what that means. And there's a lot of life and a lot of the world that cannot necessarily be mathematized in that way, and cannot necessarily be reduced into just, instrumentation or causal reactions, like the profound transformative effects of UAP experience, right?
Right.
And so we have to start relying, again, we have to understand what we see, hear, smell, taste, sense, make sense of, perceive, feel. All of that is an equally real part of what the world is, and it's complementary. It doesn't replace what's going on these instruments. Of course not. By all means, have the instrumentation, but that's only going to tell you one part of the story. We need the full picture. We need the lived experience, which is an equally real part of the world, to tell the other part of the story.
Right. So this is something that I've also seen being brought up in some of my previous podcasts. It is that the UAP problem is truly interdisciplinary, and that it's
Yeah.
not just a problem of physics and gravity and space-time and or chemistry or biology. It's also, like you say, it raises deep philosophical questions. I mean, it's clear coming. I mean, somebody who grew up and comes from an Eastern sort of a worldview that it's not just a three-dimensional world of matter. It's clear to me that science produces useful things, but the world view and our science and our model of reality clearly needs an upgrade and expansion. With the whole mainstreaming of this over the last few years, do you think it has made data collection easier or more difficult? Because with the mainstreaming and with the money coming into research and incentivizing UAP research that way, I see, especially when I go online, there are many people who are posting their own personal videos of, oh, I saw this light in the sky, I had this experience, and most of which turns out to be a drone or something like this, where it's really debunked online. So how does one take personal testimony seriously in today's world, where there's a surplus of coverage on UAPs and there's money to be made? People are writing books. Everybody has an opinion on it. So can that be taken as seriously today, to someone who's been constantly been on social media, for example, as it could have been maybe when John Mack was studying witness testimonies?
Um, yes and no. I mean, it's certainly, my interest is not to go online and verify everybody's videos as this or that. I'm not really interested in that. I will say that part of the Archives of the Impossible, or the Center of the Impossible metadata study that I'm a part of, we're looking at testimony specifically from, the 80s, the 90s, before this was mainstream in that way. Partially for that reason, we want to look at what people were reporting prior to this being out in um, mainstream discourse. But also, if you look at things like the Experiencers Forum on Reddit, um, this is individuals who are not posting trying to get fame. They're not posting trying to, write a book to make a bunch of money. And even some people who have written a book, I think you can tell pretty clearly if they're writing it just because they want attention or because they genuinely feel like they had a message to share. But you can tell when someone is just trying to work out something very strange that happened to them.
Right.
That's what I'm interested in. It's people coming and saying, holy, holy heck, I saw something 3 nights ago and I'm still messed up because of it. I don't understand what I saw. I'm so confused. Can anyone help me? Can anyone just help me make sense of this? And there, I do not see any reason to doubt that individual's credibility. Now,
Right.
again, the question is, what is it useful for? Do I take somebody's testimony in some kind of an online space and parade it around and say, this is proof of the abduction phenomena? No, that's not the point. The idea is, though, that can give us meaningful insights into how this experience is showing up for people right now, how this phenomenon is interacting with people at this moment. And so, there's yes and no. I mean, I think we have to put our critical thinking caps on. Um, Certainly, if it's clear that someone is getting a lot of attention from their story and they seem to be telling it for that reason, we can make a credibility assessment.
Right.
Again, it doesn't mean that their story is false. I would never say that. It just means that we may have reason not to take it quite as seriously as another account. But I also, in the letters that people wrote to Whitley Strieber, and the letters they wrote to John Mack, and the letters they wrote to Beth Hopkins, and in these various online communities that emerge, I see a lot of authenticity. I
Right.
see people who are not seeking fame. Many times they want to be anonymous. They don't want any attention, and they're just trying to communicate what they lived through.
Now, I want to move on to the last section of the conversation, which is on I want to focus on the shamanic perspective. But then before that, just a quick, just to understand your research, do you have to do a lot of field work to do this? Like, do you go and meet people, or is it just like online, or how does it work? How do you
No,
collect? Do you personally?
I don't do a lot of field work. So I have two parts to my research. One of them is the archival work. So this is looking at letters that people wrote um, that are in the Archives of the Impossible, or the Center of the Impossible at Rice. And I'm part of that team, and we're analyzing what kind of things people were describing as happening in those experiences. And that's taking up a lot of my time right now. I have also done a small interview study with more contemporary experiencers where I put out, that was approved by an IRB. I put out a call and to just get an understanding of individuals' meaning making process, things that, how they've made sense of it, how it's influenced their worldview and metaphysical commitments in the aftermath. And again, that was phenomenological. I was not, I was suspending judgment on the source or origin. I just wanted to hear about how they lived it. Um, and, those were done virtually. So I wasn't, again, necessarily out in the field, but that was a more, direct human subject interaction. We are going to be hopefully at some point running another round of those interviews with more participants to get a broader understanding. but it's primarily, yeah, either archival work, looking at letters, examining written artifacts, interviews, and then we do at some point also want to start systematically looking at accounts, descriptions in various online communities. But we haven't, there's not an official project underway for that yet. That's more just where we'd like to take the project next when we're done with these other steps or these other parts of it.
Have you personally had any experiences that sort of changed your view on the topic?
When I first started this, no. What a lot of people will tell you is that when you start studying this phenomenon, a lot of weird things start happening to you. So,
I think they call
um,
it the hitchhiker's effect. It comes
yeah,
back home to you.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And so various researchers have discussed this. I will say out here, I have not had any direct encounter with a being. I don't have any sighting like that. I have seen some interesting aerial phenomena very recently. I've had some interesting like dream encounters. I've had some anomalous things that have definitely started popping up. Um, some kind of interesting encounters and altered states of consciousness where strange things came through. I don't like to emphasize those parts of my work too much, but I do just mention it though because
Yeah.
I'm not the only researcher who will say that. There's others who will say, I had never had an experience. I started researching this, and then all these weird things started to happen. And I will say that has also happened to me.
Okay.
So yeah, that adds. I guess it just enhances the work that I want to do.
Yeah. The last point that I want to bring up is one of the courses that you teach is the shamanic worldviews and UFOs and UAPs, ancient wisdom, new paradigms. So what is that all about, and how does the shamanic worldview come into this?
Right now, the metadata study and we're not doing anything with shamanic worldviews, plural, because there's not just one, um, but that was more of my own interest, and John Mack had it too. But so what I'll say about this, indigenous American cultures, and also some indigenous cultures from other parts of the world as well, but they have a long history of communication with beings that they call, sky people, star beings, various names that come up for them in different tribes. And so, Nancy Red Star has documented some of that testimony in the book Extraterrestrial Contact in the Native American Tradition. And also Artie Six Killer Clark has documented, her ethnographic studies with members of different communities. And I think that it's important, and I shouldn't be the one to speak for them, but I think it's very important that we include Indigenous American, Native American views when we're studying this, because in these tribal worldviews, these indigenous worldviews, the book Restoring the Kinship Worldview by Wahinkre Topa and Darcia Narvaez is very good for discussing this. But they have a conceptual framework, or they have conceptual frameworks for making sense of this. It does not pose an existential shock. It does not pose an ontological shock, because it's very common for them. First of all, they don't have an anthropocentric understanding of the world, right? They have an understanding of the world where everything is alive, the earth is alive, the universe is alive, and that there's all kinds of non-human intelligences out there that you can interact with and that you do interact with. And so the star beings or the sky people or the star people were just another sacred entity coming from the same sacred source that you can have interactions with. And they
Right.
also don't have this division between the material and the spiritual that we have in Western culture. We have this really sharp Cartesian divide between mind and matter that's really influenced how we think in modern Western society, that has not influenced that Indigenous American people do not have. They understand the physical and the spiritual as just kind of spectrums of one reality that's there. And yes, things from the spiritual world can emerge and interact with the physical world, and they do. And they make regular use of altered states of consciousness. Like, altered states of consciousness are not considered distortion, they're considered more true than waking consciousness. And so much about this phenomenon that is so problematic from the Western scientific worldview, or that just poses this ontological shock. When you start looking at different indigenous worldviews, it doesn't pose an ontological shock at all. It's not problematic. It's just more about how the world is. It's entities that you can interact with who may be more or less densely embodied than we are, who may understand more about how to traverse the universe than we do, who may have some type of divine or spiritual knowledge, and it doesn't pose a problem. It's understood as an extension of their of their experience in a space. And
Right.
there's also Mack did some comparisons. Shamanic initiation was seen as a very traumatic, or it is seen, not was, but it is seen. It's a very traumatic experience where the individual is brought to the brink of death, and they go into the spiritual world realm, and they're often disembodied, and it's just like sheer terror. But then they come back, they're initiated into having these new abilities. It kind of widened their worldview. They now have the ability to traverse realms that they previously did not have the ability to traverse. And he said there's similarities there with the abduction experience. Like, some of these experiences are terrifying, but you emerge from the other side with an expanded ability to traverse reality, right? And so I do not think that alien abduction is reducible to shamanic initiation. I don't argue that. But I do think that there are, some similarities in archetype, and there's some differences in archetype that are worth exploring. And I think we get a more robust understanding of UFOs and UAP when we do include Indigenous American thought, or, Indigenous persons from other part of the world. When we include their views on this, we get a more holistic understanding of the phenomenon.
Yeah, I find that very interesting, and I also relate to quite a lot of this sort of the world view that you built, because coming from the Eastern tradition, coming from a Hindu tradition, we agree that we live in a more than human world. It's a given fact that there are
Given.
beings, there are seven like realms. Well, they say specifically seven lokas above and seven lokas below. There are beings who can travel back and forth. There are beings who come to help humans, who come to, they take advantage of humans and so on. But traditionally, so there's this hierarchy, and they've been looked upon as either gods and deities or demons or things like that. They've been like categorized into different, bracketed into different categories. So it's very interesting that ancient cultures view it in this way. And as the absolute last point, are there living Native American groups which still commune with star people, or is it all historical data that you're looking at?
Oh no, it's most important is to continue with people who are still living today. Um, and I my communications are with I have a couple of contacts. One is Choctaw, the other is Apache, um, and I am getting their insight, asking them directly, about their experiences, and with the hope that, I could have more direct communication with other living elders. Like, the elders in these communities possess the knowledge. But I would definitely say contact is ongoing in these communities. Um, it's not
Right.
something that's just historical. Yeah.
Right.
Wow, that's really fascinating. So I guess the whole topic of the shamanic worldview of this phenomena could be a podcast of its own, I guess. So since we're running out of time,
Yeah.
we'll have to stop here. So thank you so much for agreeing to come on the channel, and I really, really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. So thank you very much for having me on, and good luck.